0 at 10, runway 31 left at Kilo Echo, clear for takeoff.
In the early 20th century, the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company connected the world in a unique way. When British Columbia was contemplating joining Canada after the country's formation in 1867, the federal government enticed the colony with the prospect of a transcontinental railroad. British Columbia did join Canada in 1871. It took 7 years for the construction of a transcontinental railroad to begin, but the Canadian Pacific Railway was finally completed as promised in 1885. Now that the line was built and the railroad's operations were under the control of the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company, the goal was to make the nearly 2,000 miles of track economically self-sustaining. One of the ways the company strived for this goal was by securing a contract with the British government to carry mail from Hong Kong, then a British colony, back to Britain via Canada. In order to do this, the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company purchased 3 ships to carry mail, passengers, and cargo across the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. These new additions allowed passengers to seamlessly travel along a line that stretched halfway across the globe, from Britain to Hong Kong, and as the bimodal transportation services of Canadian Pacific grew in popularity, so did the fleet of ships used to supplement the Central Railroad. One of these new ships would be the Empress of Ireland and her sister, the Empress of Britain, which were ordered from Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company of Glasgow in 1905. Given the urgent and unforgiving nature of Royal Mail contracts, these 2 ships were built to a high standard and were designed to average at least 17 knots. In practice, the ship's 2 quadruple expansion engines, which powered 2 propellers, would give the ships a maximum speed of 20 knots. The ships were to be comfortable and spacious, and once complete in 1906, Empress of Ireland would come in at 14,191 gross registered tons. To put this into perspective, the world's largest ship in 1906 was a Hamburg America liner, which came in at 24,500 gross registered tons. Empress of Ireland was a large ship for the time, but not remarkably so. The Empress of Ireland was delivered after her older sister, and sailed from Quebec City on her maiden voyage in June 1906, bound for Liverpool. She would continue to serve on this route for the following 8 years, alongside her sister, Empress of Britain. During this time, little of note occurred. The Empress of Ireland dutifully carried passengers across the Atlantic and allowed the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company to fulfill its contractual obligation to Britain and the social obligation to the people of Canada. On May 29, 1914, Empress of Ireland departed Quebec City at approximately 1630 to begin the 250-mile journey to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River on her way to Liverpool. On board were 1,477 passengers and crew. Among them were actors Lawrence Irving and Mabel Hackney, 170 members of the Salvation Army, and the ship's orange tabby cat, Emmy, who had never missed a single voyage. It was not long before fog settled in. Fog was a frequent visitor on the St. Lawrence River that time of year, due to the mixing of warm air with the cold air from the frigid river. And the fog did make the work of Captain Henry Kendall a bit more challenging, but it was nothing he and his officers weren't used to. The Empress of Ireland dropped off her pilot at Father's Point after midnight and continued on her way. Meanwhile, another ship, a Norwegian collier named Storstad, was heading up the St. Lawrence and was about to pick up a pilot for the final leg of her journey to Montreal. The officers on watch aboard Empress of Ireland spotted the small ship on approach and estimated it to be about 8 miles away. Captain Kendall figured that he had plenty of room to cross the bow of the unidentified ship and get into deeper water away from the shoreline. Once clear of the Storstad's projected path, Kendall had his ship return to her proper course. As it were, the 2 ships were set to leave one another to starboard and be on their way. Suddenly, the ships were blanketed by a fresh layer of fog. Kendall ordered the engines full astern and had the ship's whistle sounded 3 times to announce the maneuver. Soon, Empress of Ireland was at a near standstill, but making enough headway to maintain course. Kendall waited for a sign that the unknown ship had passed, but the crew of Storstad had been taking action as if the 2 ships were to pass each other to port instead of to starboard. Aboard the Empress of Ireland, 2 lights emerged from the fog to starboard. They were growing larger. Impact was unavoidable, but Kendall ordered his ship hard to starboard, hoping for a glancing blow instead of a T-bone collision, but it was too late. Storstad's bow made contact right between 2 of the Empress's structural ribs, slicing the hull plating like a sheet of paper. The sleeping passengers near the point of impact awakened to the onslaught of frigid water from the St. Lawrence. The rush of water was too fast and there was no escape. Many passengers never had a chance to survive. The point of impact meant that the engine room was instantly flooded, crippling the ship and rendering the watertight doors unusable. A singular distress signal had been sent before the ship's electrical power was lost. On the boat deck, the crew scrambled to launch the lifeboats, but the ship was vanishing beneath their feet and falling to starboard as she did. Only 6 lifeboats got away before the ship was on her side, 10 minutes after the collision. Soon, the ship's list accelerated, lurching to starboard and throwing people into the water. Desperate, people clung to the ship's porthole to delay the inevitable. One survivor later described the scene like sitting on a sloping beach watching the tide come in. For a moment, the sinking slowed and it seemed that the liner had hit bottom and that her porthole would remain afloat. But then, the St. Lawrence washed over the hull of the Empress of Ireland, and those clinging to her were pulled into the water. Those in charge of the 4 remaining lifeboats cautiously and hastily pulled survivors from the water. Among those saved was Captain Kendall, who, once aboard, immediately took command. The Storstad was standing by to take on survivors, and once the lifeboat was full, offloaded his passengers to the ship, and then went back for more despite his exposure and his own risk of death. He made multiple runs, saving numerous lives until there were no more surviving souls to be helped. A radio operator at Father Point had picked up the distress signal sent by the Empress of Ireland before she went down, and 2 steamers were dispatched, the pilot boat Eureka and the mail steamer Lady Evelyn. Eureka arrived in time to save some survivors from the water, but Lady Evelyn did not appear until 3:45, but accepted passengers from the damaged Storstad. When there was nothing more to be done, the damaged but sound Storstad made way for Montreal. 1,012 had perished. A month after the sinking, a court inquiry was held to settle the question of fault for the disaster. The inquiry was held by the omnipresent Lord Mersey. After hearing from 61 witnesses, the court assigned all blame to the crew of the Storstad for attempting to pass the Empress of Ireland to port when regulations dictated they attempt to pass to starboard. The Canadian Pacific Railroad Company was awarded compensation for damages, including the Storstad herself, which was later sold for $175,000. In addition to the damages, the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company was able to recover $150,000 of silver bullion from the wreck by blasting a hole in the hull near the first-class dining room. After the salvage operation, the location of the wreck was lost to society, but was rediscovered in the 1980s. Today, the wreck lies where the ship went down 106 years ago in 130 feet of water. Marked by a red buoy, the wreck is still visited today by seasoned divers who can enter the wreck through the hole created by the salvage over a century ago. Of course, the inside of the wreck, still on its side, is remarkably dangerous, but those risk-tolerant divers who have ventured in have found some amazing things, including a set of newspapers, still readable, dated May 27, 1914. Unfortunately, not all who visit the wreck do so in good faith, and numerous items have disappeared over the years, including bones of some of the survivors. But those who visit the wreck for the right reasons will find a sobering scene frozen in a different time. Like the shipwrecks scattered across the world, the Empress of Ireland encapsulates a moment in time. The influence of transportation on history and the human experience is easier to miss than one might realize, but it can be found everywhere. This idea is the basis for this channel, and one that I am very passionate about. And so, I want to invite you into the creative process of this project that I call The Great Big Move. Please consider joining me via my Patreon page, linked in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.